So, something quite explosive is happening between the United States and their relationship. It centers on a speck of landmass most probably couldn't even find on a map, Diego Garcia. Now, this isn't just another diplomatic row about, say, a colonial leftover in the Indian Ocean. It's becoming a live operational problem at exactly the moment Washington is weighing its option over Iran and exposing a deeper question about British reliability, American trust, and how easily China can lean on the weak points of what remains of a Western alliance. Here's the strange part. The British government says that there is no pause in the deal to transfer sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. Yet a minister has told Parliament that the UK is going to pause the process for talks with the United States. So in this video, I wanted to look at exactly what is going on here, why it matters when two allies start contradicting themselves so publicly, and about something so strategically significant. That's not just about messaging and noise, but what it means for friction, which in geopolitics tends to show up at the worst possible of times.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the channel where we look at the strategy behind geopolitics, economics, and international relations. Now, we cover a lot of things, but one thing I think matters from a strategic level and precedents that it sets is happening between actors you wouldn't necessarily assume. The UK, the US, and Mauritius. Now, usually in these videos, I try to toe a balance line, but in this case, I staunchly oppose the UK giving up its control of Diego Garcia, and you'll come to find out why. But before continuing, should Britain hand over this sovereignty of this base, even if there is a lease that supposedly guarantees access? Let me know in the comments below. Now, in case you have no idea, Diego Garcia sits in the Chagos archipelago in the Indian Ocean. It hosts a joint US-UK facility used as a staging point for particularly American operations in the Middle East, which have been used for over the past 2 decades, be it over Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and similar. It is incredibly remote, secure, and positioned in a way that makes it uniquely useful for air and naval logistics. And that's why it's, suddenly back in the news and has been on a reoccurring basis for the past 2 years or so. You see, the Trump administration is reportedly weighing the military action against Iran. Recent videos you can find on the channel and in the description below. Now, Diego Garcia is exactly the kind of place that you would expect to be used for planning, distance, access, overflight, logistics, all of it. Now enter the UK's move last year to cede the territory of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, which then leases the base back for 99 years. Now, the recently elected Labour government argues that this is the only way to secure the base long term, because the sovereignty dispute and international legal pressure makes the status quo simply unsustainable. However, critics argue that the opposite is true, that the base is the most secure when the territory remains British, and transferring sovereignty introduces new veto points and new opportunities, especially for adversaries to interfere directly. And right now, that argument has moved from think tank cinemas to alliance politics. It is important to keep in mind that it was actually the previous Conservative government that established this process, not just the Labour one, and therefore you can't just make this a partisan issue. Soon after re-entering office, Donald Trump has publicly urged Starmer to not just give away Diego Garcia, framing it as reckless as a time when Iran should not be allowed to make any such deal, especially if the United States then can't leverage such a strategical standpoint. That's already an extraordinary intervention, although one should not be surprised given the man it comes from. An American president publicly pressuring a British prime minister on the sovereignty decision tied to a joint use base. But the bigger problem is this: it creates, you see, uncertainty about access. One former senior US Pacific Command official has put it more plainly, that it is suboptimal to discover a facility that was somewhere in your stroke plan may no longer be available. Even if you want to downplay that, well, they'll it'll be fine kind of analysis. The operational reality is simple. Contingency planning depends on knowing permissions, knowing basing rights, and knowing political thresholds. And if those are now in question, then you either have to redesign your plans, add unnecessary risk, or start applying more pressure, which is what we're seeing happen. Complicating this further, Trump's intervention contradicted the State Department's support for the agreement the day before. The White House has suggested that Trump's post reflected administration policy. So as always, which is it? Is the US back in the deal or not? This kind of open contradiction matters because it turns a legal question into a political weapon and invites even more not just political but public bargaining. Now, the UK government's line is that there is no, quote, pause. There is no fixed deadline and that timings will be announced in the usual way, although we don't really know what that means. But in Parliament, a Foreign Office minister said that UK is, quote, pausing legislative processes while discussions happen with the US. Mauritius Attorney General says that there's been no discussion of such processes for weeks and interprets calls as delay, not abandonment. Most likely, the UK is trying to avoid saying explicitly we're delaying because Trump has thrown a grenade into all of this, while also buying time to negotiate. Because it's not just political imbalance, it becomes a legal tripwire sitting underneath it. Aside from the political angle, the legal aspect, or the otherwise known 1966 treaty problem, is one particular aspect I think is important here. Essentially, that if the UK ratifies the agreement with Mauritius without first amending the 1966 US-UK treaty governing the availability of the British Indian Overseas Territory for defence peace purposes, the UK could end up in breach. And that matters politically because it then gives Washington even more leverage. Not that Donald Trump has much care for international law, but if the White House can credibly say you can't do this without adjusting the underlying US-UK defense arrangements, then the UK effectively has to come back to Trump and seek a buy-in. So the UK now has two persuasion tasks. Persuade the Trump administration to support the Mauritius Agreement and amend the 1966 arrangement as needed, or persuade Parliament to pass the implementing legislation. That's why the bill returning to the House of Lords has been postponed, and the politics in Washington has changed. And the UK can't pretend otherwise. The bilateral relationship between the British and the Americans has never really been the same since the Blair-Clinton peak of the 90s. Many people simply see the UK as enacting on American foreign policy and never really having much of its own. Some people can go further back and emphasize that the Suez Crisis of 1956 was really the last time that the British government pushed to have an independent foreign policy without seeking approval from Washington. Now, let's steelman the government's case first. The government says the agreement is the only way to guarantee the long-term future of the base. The treaty text reportedly guarantees, quote, unrestricted access, basing, and overflight for UK and US aircraft and vessels. In other words, sovereignty changes, access doesn't. From that view, the deal is largely a firewall. Settle the sovereignty dispute, protect the base, remove the permanent legal cloud hanging over it. Now let's consider the steelman of the critics' case. They argue that sovereignty is not decoration. Sovereignty is the foundation of enforceable control. And transferring it to Mauritius creates an extra political actor whose future government may simply reinterpret terms of their own free will. A new surface area for coercion by other powers, and new legal hooks that can be used to contest operations, which, given how long certain legal jurisdictions can take to decide, would be hugely problematic. Critics also reject the idea Mauritius can force a binding sovereignty judgment without UK consent. They point out that the 2019 ICJ opinion, which much of this is based on, is simply advisory, it's not binding, and therefore did not establish Mauritian sovereignty. And they argue that in any international bodies the government worries about, telecoms or civil aviation mechanisms, for example, are unlikely to practically constrain future military operations. Essentially, their message is the UK is surrendering sovereignty not because it must, but because it has decided to treat legal pressure as an inevitability rather than something to resist. And given the inconsistent implementation of international law by Western countries as much as non-Western ones, I find it suddenly rather odd that we're becoming so obsessed about adhering to it. Now, of course, then you can't talk about this without, well, the Chinese elephant in the room. Mauritius has signed a free trade deal with China in 2019. It has positioned itself as, quote, a strategic regional platform for Beijing. Critics argue economic pressure could translate into political constraints over time. Not an eviction, but incremental encroachment that makes the base harder to use, more politically costly, and just more conditional. You see, this is how modern influence often works. You don't seize the base, you create enough friction, legal controversy, and domestic political pressure in the host country that access then becomes contested. We've seen this countless of times across Latin American, African, or Asian states. And even if you think the most extreme versions of this are overstated, it's obvious why Washington cares. The US does not like strategic dependencies where a third party can even theoretically jam the gears. We've just seen the Starmer government impede their usage of British bases for American personnel and assets during the potential operations against Iran. So what happens if you add a third party into the equation? A former Australian liaison, for example, has put it bluntly that in a serious conflict scenario, the US would not accept loss of access to Diego Garcia, lease, sovereignty, legal status, none of it will matter. That statement does two things, therefore. It signals resolve to Mauritius and any external backers, and it signals pressure, even more so to London. Don't create a situation where access becomes contested. To add fuel to the fire, critics also claim that the Mauritius Treaty introduces fresh legal vulnerabilities that do not exist under the status quo. Three examples matter in plain English for us. One, the international law compliance as a pressure level. Basically, if the agreement requires activities related to Diego Garcia to comply with international law, Mauritius could argue a particular operation is unlawful and therefore violates the agreement, creating grounds for dispute, countermeasures, or complete negotiation. Second, notification requirements. Simply, in this case, that if the UK is required to inform Mauritius about uses of force originating from the base, timely disputes then become leverage. You told us too late. You didn't tell us properly. You breached the agreement. All this adds headache, and not what you need when there's a military escalation. Three, nuclear weapons-free obligations. If Mauritian obligations under the Treaty of Pelindaba extend to Diego Garcia after sovereignty transfer, critics also argue it constrain what makes Diego Garcia so strategically valuable and unique, or at least, at a minimum, create reoccurring political disputes around compliance. You don't need to take a view on every legal detail to see the structural point, therefore. New hooks create new veto moments. And at a time when we are seeing an unprecedented level of geopolitical tension, added legal barriers in the ability of operations and military counterbalancing is not necessarily the best thing, even if it does go against the idea of everything that we think about in international law. It's not necessarily something that I like to say, but in this circumstance, I consider it ridiculous that we are considering foregoing such a strategically significant place and still trying to make use of it, but leasing it. Personally, I think it would be better to find a more comprehensive solution that not only the Mauritian government, but the Chagos people could also find suitable. Well, with all of that in mind, where does this actually go then? Well, to me, there are three possible scenarios. Scenario one, the UK slows the process and negotiates again around the pressures of Trump. It seeks explicit US endorsement, adjusts this 66 treaty arrangement, and packages the whole thing as a sort of strengthening the base's legal footing. It would be the least disruptive, but it depends on Washington believing the UK can deliver a deal that doesn't simply create new constraints. Scenario two is, of course, Trump continues to escalate the pressure and the deal becomes just too politically toxic. If Trump keeps framing this as Britain giving away a key facility, it becomes a domestic political problem in both countries. Parliament will drag its feet, the Lords will delay, and the issue becomes a symbolic test of the special relationship, although in my mind, frankly, that doesn't exist anymore and was a joke in recent years anyway. Scenario three is that the deal proceeds, but Alliance Trust takes yet another hit and planners adapt. Even if the treaty guarantees access on paper, the US and UK may decide that any third-party sovereignty introduces uncertainty they'd rather avoid. That doesn't mean the base becomes unusable, but it does mean its role becomes much more conditional, with backups and alternatives built in, which is exactly what critics mean by operationally irrelevant. Not closed, just less central. But considering just how central it has been in the past 20, 25 years, I don't see how it suddenly doesn't. And ultimately, isn't it just better to admit that this is just something too important to forego, than instead of trying to give the deal, follow through, but then renege on it and come across as hypocrites? Because it doesn't put you in good standing and only gives more fuel to your adversaries, who in this case, as we've discussed, could leverage it significantly. So what happens depends on something much bigger than a legal dispute over sovereignty. It's not really about one island, but it's about how alliances function under stress, and especially under this sort of seeming permi-crisis of stress. When the US is weighing military options, it wants maximum flexibility. And the UK, when trying to resolve a long-running sovereignty dispute, wants legal closure. Or when China looks at Mauritius, they see potential levers. Because Diego Garcia becomes politically constrained, even slightly, it changes how Washington plans for contingencies, not just against Iran, but across entire escalation ladders. It changes what operations exist at the lowest levels of signaling, at intermediate levels of coercion, and at the highest levels of direct military action. And once planners start doubting whether a base is guaranteed, they don't wait for Axis to disappear. They start redesigning the entire escalation ladder around that uncertainty. With that in mind, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then do consider subscribing and sharing it with someone else who you think might find value in it. If you want to learn more about escalations and how they come about, check out this video here on Iran.